Welcome to the 25th episode of the Urban Lunch Talk series. This is where we gather research and investment stakeholders in and around the DUT program that we think should have lunch together and synthesize their evidence-based knowledge. I'm Jennifer and I work with communications for the DUT partnership. I have the pleasure of hosting today's webinar. Also with me, I have my colleagues, Kajsa, Ida, and Anna, who's back supporting me with the technical parts and the chat. I hope you're all having a nice lunch wherever you are. Please let us know in the chat where you're joining in from. And during this lunch, please remember to keep sharing your ideas, comments, and questions in the chat. We will have some time towards the end of the webinar to answer these. And also note that this webinar is recorded and we will publish this later on the Driving Urban Transitions YouTube channel. Today, we have with us 4 representatives from 3 different research projects that was funded in the JPI Urban Europe call, Urban Migration. And the aim of this call was to create a deeper understanding of the ways that migrants or migration affects and is affected by the life and functioning of European cities. And these projects finished in the beginning of 2023. And here in the chat now you can find a link to a project's results catalog that shares some results from each of these projects in an easy accessible format. But the 3 projects that we have with us today, they all focused on the topic urban governance and housing issues in different ways. So they have both explored the experience of migrants in European housing markets and also research how integration can be improved with innovative housing strategies. And we are excited to have on the panel then Annegret Haase from the Housing Project. We have Eva Maria Kehrer and Katharina Kirsch-Soriano da Silva from the Inclusive Housing Project, and also Florian Koch from the ProSHARE project. Very well welcome to all of you. Thank you so much for being here with us today. But to kick off our conversation, I would like to zoom in on the Housing Project. Annegret, the Housing Project studies the nexus between housing and integration. Could you share some key takeaways from the project and elaborate a little bit on how housing strategies influence migrants' integration?
Yes, hello everybody. I'm happy to be here and to share some of our results and learnings with you. The Housing Project focused on what we called the housing integration nexus. We focused on the group of forced migrants because migration is a huge and heterogeneous topic. And so we thought that to become a bit more precise with our learnings and topics, we decided to focus on forced migrants. We had a cross-national comparison, our project. So we had different case studies in Riga, Latvia, in Lund and Helsingborg in Sweden, in Vienna, Austria, and in Leipzig, Germany. So quite different contexts. It would take me too long to speak about these context specifics, but you can be sure we can maybe discuss afterwards that it's a really, really important topic that again and again came across when we discussed issues. Housing integration nexus, what is it and why is it important? We think that housing is a crucial issue when people and forced migrants arrive at a new place. It is the basis for integration. It focuses also on settling and integrating into the society at the place of reception. It is more than accommodation. When looking at this nexus, we also dealt with barriers for housing integration, including the question, what does it mean for integration or for settling down when housing fails, when housing situation remains precarious, marginalized, etc. We did this in this cities in using a transdisciplinary research approach. We worked with urban living labs that allowed us to first focus on the local specifics. So we had a team, a transdisciplinary team of scientific partners and stakeholders in every city. And the questions, the details we discussed were really up to the needs at the places. But also we paid attention to some cross-cutting questions to see what is more than locally important. And that also provided a base for an exchange of municipal stakeholders or other stakeholders between our partners. For instance, municipal stakeholders discussed novel approaches to how welcome refugees and how to provide innovative and effective measures or frameworks for organizing the settling down of forced migrants. We also organized exchanges between stakeholders at our places because normally in practice this is sometimes quite difficult, and projects like ours provided an opportunity to meet and to exchange. During the lifetime of our project, there came up the challenge of the Ukrainian forced migration due to the Russian war of aggression since 2022. And we took this as a chance for science, for transdisciplinary science, to integrate this topic into our project. We discussed the questions how arrival and accommodation, housing integration worked in this case. We compared the case of Ukrainian forced migrants with other forced migrants groups and revealed their quite interesting issues, such like double standards, different forms and hierarchies of discrimination, but also a lot of local innovation and a high empathy and willingness of local population to help, which maybe could be discussed as a chance also for broader topic of forced migration. Cross-cutting challenges that we met at all our places, no matter how difficult they are, was discrimination as a general problem, and also the double standards when Ukrainian forced migration became a topic. At most of our places, there were found short-term responses to long-term challenges. We all know tents, gyms, etc. as accommodation, but we also had the chance to meet temporary housing projects in Sweden or collaborative housing projects, very specific projects, but of course you can also learn from them and ask yourself, could it be transferred to another place? We discussed this between Sweden and Riga, for instance. A cross-cutting benefit for our project was the good and reliable cooperation within the team. We made, I think also like the other projects, experiences to work transdisciplinary in times of Corona. So we had a lot of online meetings, and it was, of course, a challenge to organize transdisciplinary exchange in an online communication world. But also we had to rely on our stakeholders, and we made use of their experiences, time and goodwill. And we also learned how difficult it is for them to work under precarious circumstances and how much expertise there is among the stakeholders. When you want to learn more about our project and the outcomes, we can provide you with some of our publications, policy informations, blog, and also a curriculum for students as self-learners that we provided based on our results. And a positive news also at the end of my short talk, there are new projects starting that have the chance to dig deeper into the topic, because as you can imagine, 18 months for an international project is a very short time, and we could just start to work on many questions and will hopefully continue in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Annegret, for sharing very interesting perspectives that we will discuss further then in the discussion part. And as Annegret mentioned, there are a lot of publications and useful information about the projects, and you have a link there in the chat to the project page where you can find all of this. But now I would like also to introduce Eva Maria Kehrer and Katharina Kirsch-Soriano da Silva, and you're both part of the Inclusive Housing Project, which investigated what obstacles refugees, but also other disadvantaged groups are facing in terms of access to long-term housing. And it would be very interesting to hear the results from your project and hear what makes housing inclusive.
Yeah, hello from our side as well. From our part, I will start and Eva will do the second part. So we were working on this project from Caritas Vienna. So it's a social organization, an NGO. And just to start about talking the project, maybe it's important to talk a little bit about our starting point, because our starting point was a daily practice in neighborhood and community work, where we are working every day with refugees, with migrants, with different people living in the cities and in different neighborhoods. And we are doing like also peer-to-peer projects, so fostering people coming from certain communities in order to, as volunteers, as multipliers, act within their communities, and of course in the arrival process. And of course there are many topics, but as you said, housing is one of the most crucial ones for many migrants and refugees. And so we were starting as an NGO to see like many precarious housing situations and thinking like, but who does know about them? And so we searched for partners in universities, in research institutions, and first did a small study in Vienna where we interviewed 22 refugees from different countries and looked into their housing biographies. And so from their countries of origin, the flight, and especially the different housing stations since they arrived in Austria. And this was very insightful for us. But what we saw was that especially because I think Vienna is known for a huge social housing market, but for these groups, the accessibility for the social segments in housing is, especially in the first years, quite difficult. And so the accessibility, not just the affordability, but the accessibility is quite an issue. And so I think this was the starting point where we thought we have to work up our way to the stakeholders involved, so to cities, municipalities, stakeholders like housing associations. And this was the starting point for inclusive housing. At an EU level, we worked with Sweden and Germany together and tried to involve those stakeholders. And so I will now give the word to Eva to talk a little bit more about our stakeholder processes in inclusive housing.
Yeah, thanks, Katharina, for the starting and insights already. Just to shortly also introduce myself, I was working with Katharina in the project team of inclusive housing at Caritas, and also I'm a social worker and political scientist, so I've also already been working with refugees on a practical level before, but now I'm more on a strategic level, working for an institution called Urban Innovation Vienna, a subsidiary agency of the city of Vienna. So that's just to give some context to why we are talking together, but are located in different institutions. But yeah, to dive into the project Inclusive Housing, the project was realized from April 2021 to September 2022, and we were a project consortium existing of the German Institute of Urban Affairs, the EMEA University in Sweden, and the University of Vienna, and the Caritas, as Katharina already said. And the focus, or the project's objective, was to compare the challenges for housing for refugees in the three countries, Austria, Germany, and Sweden, but with a focus on the three cities, Hamburg, Vienna, and EMEA. And the main goal was to elaborate recommendations for future housing policies and practices in order to enhance the situation for refugees. So the focus was really on the strategic level, on the policy level, and to formulate recommendations for that. And our approach was not to just discuss the challenges and elaborate recommendations amongst us in the project team, but to involve practice and transfer partners and stakeholders right from the start. So what we did is we invited advocacy and interest groups such as the Austrian Chamber of Labor in Austria in Vienna, or the Municipal Housing Association Saga from Germany, and or the Swedish Tenants Association to discuss together with us and find solutions for the challenges and problems. And I saw that also practice and transfer partner is also here today, Katharina Kirsch-Soriano. A nice welcome to you. It's great that you're here. She was also part of the discussion groups. She's from the Ministry of Urban Development in Hamburg. So yeah, we did how we did that. We organized 3 transnational workshops, which formed the core of the project. And each workshop focused on one topic with the goal to formulate or to produce policy briefs. And I think we will not go into depth with the topics, but I just briefly want to give an outline. The first workshop was focusing on the housing markets and access to housing. It was held in Vienna and mainly focused on the structures of the different housing markets in the cities and nations of Germany, Austria, and Sweden, and also in the different actors that shape housing markets. And of course, the goal was to find possible avenues in order to enhance the situation for refugees. The second workshop was focusing on special types of inclusive housing, starting with the assumption that housing and social integration, of course, do belong together, as Katharina also already mentioned, and also starting with the assumption that these so-called special types of housing often lie outside of the regular housing market, meaning that it is often community-oriented forms of living together, supported by social actors and initiatives. And the question here was, what can we do, or what should we do? What could we learn from these so-called special types of housing? And the third topic was governance for inclusive housing. And here we looked at municipal development strategies that already exist in the 3 countries or the 3 cities, and and to discuss possible avenues for improvement. Yes, and so that was the 3 topics of the workshops. And just to quickly add that we additionally to the 3 workshops, we also collected best practice examples from the 3 countries, which show different aspects and innovative approaches for housing and the promotion of social inclusion for refugees. So that was also important for us in the project to not only look at the policy levels, but also to really give practical insights into how to improve the situation. Yeah, I think I'll leave it at that for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Eva Maria and Katharina as well for the introduction. Now over to our final guest then, Florian. You have been working with the ProSHARE project, which has a focus on sharing practices, not only in housing, but also in public spaces. Could you share with us what the project investigated, and maybe also explain why sharing is important in this context?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for the invitation. I present some of the results of our ProSHARE project. The aim was to analyze how practices of sharing can enhance diversity, inclusion, and social cohesion in housing and public spaces. We analyzed sharing practices in urban neighborhoods in London, Paris, Uppsala, Vienna, Berlin, Stuttgart, and Kassel. Sharing, it's quite a difficult, complex term. It's quite fashionable in urban development. We all know the sharing economy. We all know Uber, we know Airbnb, but our focus was on non-commercial forms of sharing. So sharing of things, of information, of public spaces, of housing. The aim of our project was to analyze 3 things. So first, how and what do people actually share in neighborhoods? What is the potential of sharing for bringing diverse urban populations together? And how can we as researchers support non-commercial sharing in so-called real-world labs? What we did a lot of things, but I will only focus on one thing, which was our questionnaires, which we did in all the urban neighborhoods. And I quickly present some of the main findings. So the question is, how and what is shared? We found out that activities, services, and information are shared most frequently, thus non-tangible goods. What of the inhabitants, we asked, do this quite frequently? Private spaces, such as housing, are shared less often, but still 1/5 of the inhabitants answered that they do this frequently. It was interesting because there's no correlation between commercial forms of sharing and non-commercial forms of sharing. So if a person uses paid services for car sharing or for home sharing, this does not allow conclusions about non-commercial sharing. So there was no connections between those types of sharing. We then asked, and this was quite interesting, we asked them, why do you share? And 75% of the people who answered says, because I share because I like the people with whom I share. 66% said because it's more sustainable. 52% said I share because this is how I meet and how I get to know other people. And only 37% says I share for monetary reasons, to save money. So most people do not share because they have to, but because they want to. We then asked, how is sharing organized? And it's mainly through personal contacts. We all know about digitalization, we all know about the internet, but sharing is mainly organized through personal contacts. The internet also plays a role, but it's not that important. We ask then, what is the potential of sharing for bringing diverse populations together? We asked people also from less represented groups in our neighborhoods, and we found out that nationality or religion does not have an influence whether you share or not. So it is not just one demographic group which shares, it's different groups in the neighborhood who all are involved in sharing. We asked also, with whom do you share? And there, the neighborhood aspect was very important. People share mainly with people in their neighborhood. Neighborhood is the main location for sharing information, goods, spaces. People share mainly with people they know, which have the same age and language and culture. But these correlations are rather low. Sharing is not really socially selective. In our neighborhoods, people do not share only with people from the same culture. And it was interesting because we found out how we asked the people, how did you get to know the people with whom you share? And we had neighborhoods with multifamily housing. So the most important thing was the house you're living in, but then also in public space, on festivals and markets. So in things which are happening in the neighborhood. This was an important point where people can share. And this is the last finding I want to present, that the more people use public infrastructure in their neighborhood, such as public spaces, community gardens, or other kind of public infrastructure, the more intensive they are involved in sharing activities. So people who use public infrastructure are more likely to have intensive forms of sharing. So, and this is, I conclude with this, if we want to support sharing, we need to create and to maintain those places. I'm speaking only of non-commercial forms of sharing, social interaction in the neighborhood. And well, ProSHARE was the name of our project, so I'm really happy to share more information about our project with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Florian. And before we open up the discussion to all of you, maybe I can have a follow-up question. You did a lot of research on sharing, but why is sharing important? Does it improve integration, or why are we talking about sharing in this context?
we started with the assumption that we have many gentrification tendencies. So there is a competition for space in many European neighborhoods. And our idea was to think if sharing could be a way to deal with these tendencies. If the competition for space is stronger, then probably we can speak about other uses, how to use different kind of spaces, multifunctional uses. We started with housing, but found out that housing it's not that easy to share. People first start with sharing other things, and then probably they think about if there is some kind of shared houses. This is like a niche issue of sharing, but still it's related. Obviously, if you feel well in the neighborhood, you like to share, and your neighborhood is getting better.
Thank you. And I think we will go deeper into this sharing in housing specifically further in the discussion. But let's open up a question to all of you. We talk about urban migration, which is quite a broad term. And let's go back to the definition of this. Annegret, you said that you've focused in your project on forced migrants. But what is actually urban migration, and how have you dealt with this definition in your projects?
Yeah, I think migration itself was for us more a context than a real topic. Our topic was the housing integration, so that means a part of the arrival, I would say. I like to work with this term of arrival because we dealt with the reception context, not with the context of origin of people. Normally, I would say, and I learned that now in a new project, I spoke about these follower projects, that migration, of course, has these two aspects: the context of origin and reception, and the contacts between, or the relations between these two contexts. But in our project, we dealt with the context of reception, with the let's say reception societies, places, infrastructures, and we think that housing is a nucleus that determines a lot of aspects concerning arrival. So how arrival happens, how newcomers have, what chances newcomers have to get familiar with the reception context and to settle down and become part of the local society. And so we thought that housing is a good topic for integration. That's what we dealt with, and so migration, I would see it as a context of our question, and a very, very complex issue.
Yeah, maybe I can add a little bit. Yeah, I think in our research, especially in the biographical insights, of course, migration, so these different stations, these different experiences played a certain role. And also it was interesting to see on how you originally maybe lived, or how was your housing situation in your country of origin or in different station. Of course, this further on influences your expectations or your ideas of housing also in the present. And so maybe this aspect concerns maybe this idea of migration. And of course, as Annegret said, if we talk about refugees, of course, it's also a forced migration. And so there are also traumatic experiences involved in quite big parts of this history and biographical history as well. But in general, I think in our project, in the inclusive housing project, we also focused more on the term of inclusion and inclusive housing, and what can inclusive housing mean for all the people living here now in our cities. And so like we have different aspects that we have to work on, as I said. So it's the formal criteria for housing market, the informal criteria, the knowledge about it. So orientation, how to navigate quite complex housing market is an issue, I think, sometimes underestimated, because you think like about all the formal access criteria that you have to give, but in many cases it's quite a question of language, but also of knowledge. Yeah.
Maybe I can shortly add on to what Katharina said. Because I think it's important to mention that if you talk about inclusion, it is about everybody. It is about everyone, and includes the whole, everybody who lives in a city or a nation. And what is another factor is that migration is such a complex topic, and it got more and more complicated since the 90s. And we cannot talk about one group of refugees or one group of people who migrated, but because it's so diversified, this also makes it more difficult to discuss the topic. Also between the three countries, we found out it is very, there is some similarities, but also it is a very diverse group of people we're talking about. But what we can say is that what we did not touch upon was the group of illegalized migrants, so the ones that don't have a legal status or don't have the status as refugees, because that's just another very difficult, or not difficult, but that's another topic, and that we didn't really discuss in depth. So it was really the focus on refugees with also different legal statuses, and but in general disadvantaged groups in the context of urban migration. But what we have to mention is, I think, is that of course there's people who migrate within European countries who are just a lot more privileged than others. And if we talk about refugees, we talk about specific challenges that are also just very specific for this group of people who are discriminated on various levels, and that is a specific policy challenge which needs to be focused when we also talk about inclusivity or inclusion of people in cities.
Yeah, I will jump in here. You were saying it's very interesting with the approach with inclusive housing, and it includes everyone, because migrants, as you mentioned, is not the only disadvantaged group, and there is a competition for long-term affordable housing in general. So my question maybe to you is like, how can we balance policies in providing accommodation to not only a separate group, but to different groups? Because it is in a way a competition for accommodation. Or maybe not only policies, it can be other strategies as well.
I mean, maybe, I don't know, but I just quickly reacted, and then maybe the others want to say something to it as well. My answer would be, I think, on a normative level, or what we also discussed in the project, is that accessibility, affordability, and adequacy of housing should just be treated as benchmarks for the development of housing in general. So I think that's on a normative level, that's just something that we can also take with us from the project of inclusive housing, that we should also just think about how housing is treated and why it is commodified as it is at the moment, and that we also maybe need to work on the mindsets on what housing means, and to also work together with actors, build alliances, I don't know, talk with each other, and not only see the task of inclusion as something that is up to the governments or the municipal housing agencies, but also as a task for everyone, also the private sector, the limited profit sector, and the social housing sector. So I think it's up to everyone in order to enhance the situation, if we really want to shape a good life for everybody in cities and make them more livable.
I know Annegret has to leave. I'm not sure if you want to say something more. If not, I will jump in.
No, please, Florian, jump in. I have still some 5 minutes and can think about.
Yeah, well, I think it's important. Housing obviously is a basic need, and we can see this in the case of forced migration, very provocative. So you need housing, but I would also think, and this is something what we found out, that housing companies not only need to offer houses where to live, but they have also the potential and can make use of it to offer those kind of shared spaces. Some housing companies do this, and this provides for the people something more than housing. I think that these kind of spaces are very important also for, probably not integration, but for social interaction, which is important. So if we're speaking about social housing, it's not just the numbers, it's also the quality. And I think, well, the house itself is important, the flat itself is important, but also the environment. What kind of urban spaces do we create? And well, from our project, we need spaces where people can share without spending money. So this would also be something to as part of inclusive housing, I think.
Maybe I can just add one thought. I mean, we didn't deal with inclusive housing, but we met some examples of perfect non-inclusive housing for forced migrants. For instance, in our case study in Sweden, in Lund, I think it was, that was built at the margins of this municipality, in a pure rural community, was built in good distance from the other buildings, just a housing complex for newcomers. The housing itself was okay, I think, but they were just meeting forced migrants and had no real good chance to integrate. There was a school opposite where also almost only the refugees' children just could attend. So that means for us, it was a perfect segregation. There is the chance for those people to buy later on their flats, but this does not resolve the problem of non-inclusion. And when the most interesting for us was when we asked, why do you build such housing projects or housing complexes? They told us quite honestly, our society in Lund, they are not ready to welcome so many forced migrants. And so we should maybe keep a distance. That was a very interesting and I think a very complex and a very delicate question. We were happy to hear these open words, but what does it mean? I mean, and this was in the chat, was one question. Is inclusiveness or diversity always desirable? I mean, we could discuss it among ourselves, but I think when we include the whole communities, then it gets more complicated. And I think we have to further discuss this question.
Yeah, I want to talk maybe a little bit about the question of inclusive for who. And so I think we started in our discussion from the refugees, but ended up in many points thinking about how housing can be inclusive for everyone. And so our first policy brief, for instance, I think the first point is create a big amount of affordable housing, or see how housing can be affordable for everyone. And so, of course, because if this works, then housing for many groups, for many people works. And so, of course, we discussed, like in the 3 countries, it's not the same background. So in Austria, we have this tradition of limited profit housing associations, for instance. And in Germany, this idea of non-profit housing or limited profit housing has been abolished some years ago. But I think there is discussion going on about, would it make sense to reintroduce it again? And I think Sweden in general has a focus on public policies in general, and thinking like a social housing, not a special housing, but as public housing. yeah, and so we have different approaches, but I think it's interesting in how to think this with like non-profit or public actors, but we also were discussing about private actors in the housing market. And of course, you have instruments like zoning laws. For instance, in Vienna, you have in bigger new quarters, you have now the obligation that 2/3 have to be the zoning category of subsidized housing. And so this is to enforce even for private actors to do an amount of more affordable housing, for instance. And the city makes urban development contracts to also think not just of the quantities, but as you mentioned, of the qualities, what this housing and neighborhoods should have. And so I think it's important to, develop further those instruments and learn from each other. And the other aspects, of course, are also, I think, what you mentioned, Florian, these places for encounter, for not just the private spaces, but the common spaces in housing, because maybe in general, I could say from our interviews and from our context, the question of social networks and the roles of social networks, they're such an important and crucial role for arrival processes, for inclusion, integration processes. And of course, we see like many in the first place, maybe using their own language or ethnic networks, family networks, but you also see that if you it's possible to encounter and to create other networks, like networks with more local population, etc. You also have access to further aspects of city life. And so this question of networks is quite important. And I think here this the connection to the sharing initiatives are quite interesting also for housing. Yeah.
It's a very interesting perspectives, and I'm picking up some questions here from the chat. And the last one coming in here is about co-housing. And the question is there a market for low-income migrant background as well, or only a middle-class project? And I know that there are some examples of co-housing in all of your projects. So yeah, could you please elaborate on this question?
Yes, perfectly. I can say some words. We one of our project areas was Kreuzberg in Berlin, which is known for co-housing projects emerging from the from stranded housing. So people developed on their own co-housing projects, which exist now, some of them for more than 30 years, and it's very based on sharing. And we made interviews with people living there, and we asked them, well, how open are you to other groups entering? And their whole approach is very leftist, very anti-capitalistic approach, and that said we tried, but it was difficult because our values concerning, for example, gender issues are so important that we need to find people who support our values. So within these projects, the group of people who live in these co-housing areas is rather homogeneous, a certain kind of group, a certain kind of lifestyle. And it's a pity because, well, those they intend to be open, but it didn't work out that well. Not only referring to migrants, but to all people. So the co-housing projects are, what we found out, very homogeneous. There are people who share the same lifestyle, the same way on looking to the world, and in the projects we analyzed, it's difficult to make these more diverse. Still, what we found out also is that public housing companies, are developing experiments with co-sharing, cluster housing, in order to make this idea of co-housing a little bit broader. It's still an experiment, so we haven't yet really done analysis on the results because it's just started. But I think this could be a way also to foster this kind of idea.
Yeah, maybe I can also add on to that. I think it was really interesting what you said before, Florian, that you mentioned that people like to share, but that housing is something that is not so easy to share. And I was immediately thinking about the situation so after the Ukrainian war started, because in Austria we had, like in many other countries, we had the situation that, of course, a lot of people came to Vienna, and there was a huge lack of available housing, accessible housing. And so what happened is that a lot of people opened up their private homes to these forced people who were forced to come or to go to another country. And I think right now it's 78% living in private accommodation or shared accommodation. So I think what is important here is that there's a huge difference between those who like voluntarily decide to share a home in, for example, cooperative housing projects, and those who are also in a way forced to share. And it's, of course, I say that in a slight provocative way, but I also think that it's important to keep in mind that sharing also needs to be something that people decide for themselves on a voluntary level and not to be forced into, and that it is especially the group of migrants or disadvantaged migrants and refugees who are sometimes forced into sharing because they simply have no other choice. So I think that is something we need to keep in mind when we talk about sharing on the one hand. And then on the other, I think there's so many possibilities when it, or so many advantages when it comes to sharing. And what we have in Vienna is we have a quite long tradition and also institutionalized form of sharing in subsidized housing, because property developers in Austria, when they get subsidies, are legally bound to create shared or common spaces without the need to consume goods. And that is something which, and those spaces are also accompanied by social actors such as the Caritas. So social actors then help people to create regulations on how they want to use the shared space, and they also accommodate them or help them in I don't know, so just creating a good atmosphere amongst them. And I think that is something that has a huge potential, and I think maybe Katharina can tell even more about that. But I think there's a huge potential in these shared spaces that are between flats, because the common spaces in Vienna in the social housing, they are so that every person has their own flat, but then there's some community space in between, and these function as meeting points between the people who are living in the houses. And I think that's one great approach to enhancing meeting and to enhance also communication between different groups.
Yeah, maybe I can add a little bit from our booklet of practice examples what we encountered, but because I think there are quite different aspects of co-housing. So we have some co-housing projects where it's like a traditional co-housing project, but the group of co-housers have social goals, and so they say, okay, it's us, but like we create 2, 3, 4 flats for people in need. And so it could be homeless people, but especially in Austria, we found some examples as well where there were some flats for refugees, for instance. But what in general the experience was that since they were not in general part of the whole co-housing process in the first place, there continues sometimes to still be a difference between the original co-housing community and the refugee families they take in. Also, we had like an interesting project that Caritas initiated. I think there was an example in the chat that said initiatives for students and refugees, so like young refugees living together. So we here had a quite interesting familiar experience, which was quite interesting and working well. Yeah, I think what with our housing associations in the process, they talked a lot about the concept of pool housing or housing first, not just for homeless people, but even for refugees. So it's not classic co-housing, but it's the idea on how to mix a little bit more and include some people more disadvantaged on the housing market in housing complexes. And yeah, just and I think this what Eva said, this sharing in private homes, even before the Ukrainian war, there were civil society initiatives like, for instance, Refugees Welcome or others, who also started to like propose to convey in normal in shared flats. And so in general, I think it's also more young people or students that are quite mixed shared flats. And so they were trying to do this connection, like young refugees also finding apartments there. And what we found from our biographical interviews, of course, for many refugees, sharing flats or sharing housing are the first stations, so on the private market, because very it's many cannot afford an own flat or cannot find, and so shared housing, but forced shared housing, of course, and in very different conditions. Because if you have flats like where for every person you have one room, it's like an okay shared flat, but you also have these quite precarious situations where you have like many people in one room. And we did not even call these shared flats, we called it like sleeping places. And of course we also have this, and here we see like there other forms of inclusion are very difficult, because how will you keep your quiet, how can you learn, how can you start to really start your life here if this is your housing place. And so I think for many, and maybe this also has to do with it, when they get the opportunity to find like a non-shared flat, I think it's the choice that many of them, if it's possible, would make. Yeah.
Yeah, we have a little bit more time, and I would like to ask you how you have identified a lot of innovative solutions in your projects, but how can they be replicated between these like different study cities, and how can we bring your research into practice? Big question.
Good question.
What
I
would you
will
like to
just mention two things before I go to your question. I think it's important to mention that you have to choose if you want to share with whom you share. So this is the big thing also from an urban sociology perspective. The city is always you can choose with whom you share, and obviously if you're forced to share with people, then other kind of conflicts will emerge, and this is probably important to mention. There are a lot of interesting questions in the chat. I just want to mention shortly the sustainability issue, because obviously space is scarce, and if we find better use for housing, but also for other kind of spaces, we can have a more sustainable, we can deal more sustainable with space, which is specifically difficult in inner city areas where we have also urban heat islands. So sustainability is a big issue, but we haven't yet focused on our research exactly on the sustainability potential of sharing. It exists, but we haven't done research on this, but I think it's important. Transferring of our results very briefly. I mean, we try to find possibilities. We build up meeting places in public space to support those contact places. It's quite difficult because the maintenance needs to be secured. There are some building laws which are also not supporting kind of flexible sharing places. So I think there is really something to find governance measures to support it. The ideas are there, but it's very difficult to implement these in different European cities because building laws are different, because the context is different. So we're struggling, especially with law issues, which make it difficult to transfer ideas to other places.
Yeah, I think as Caritas, as an NGO and quite a big NGO, at least in Austria, I think there are some potentials for realization because in our daily work with our target groups, but also I think it was Annegret who mentioned also this potential of volunteers, of persons from society, from civil society. And of course, there are independent civil society initiatives, but there are also lots of people contacting us, especially when we have new waves of migration of refugees. And I think the media often does not report on that so much, but we also see a lot of solidarity and a lot of people wanting to help in arrival processes. And so, of course, I think there is quite, in the social aspect, quite a potential for impact. And also, as you said, like Caritas creating these information spaces, but also this encountering spaces, so where people who are already living here, people coming in can meet, can create new social networks, and in some aspects professional organizations can help, but in some aspects it's just people living in the city that can help and social contacts that can help. And so I think this is a very important aspect. And on the other hand, as Eva already said, we're also working with housing associations, especially in the limited profit housing sector and the subsidized housing, and of course, and also with municipalities. And so, of course, here you have like decision makers, you have like policy actors, and I think there is quite a great will, especially in this sector, to see this need and to see how social organizations and how housing associations can work together to think of better, innovative, or simply just affordable, inclusive solutions together. It's not always the new solutions that are better, but yeah, the quality solutions.
All right, if we want to send our crowd home with some something to think about, I would like you to summarize very shortly with a do and a don't when it comes to improving social integration in the housing market. So what should we do to improve it, and what shouldn't we do? If you need a moment to think, I can take a moment just to share also in the chat 2 articles. That was also a part of the synthesis from the urban migration call. So we have a really good article on the housing topic, and also one with policy recommendations from the urban migration project. So have a look at these if you're interested to read more about this topic. Eva Maria.
Yeah, I think I can start. I mean, very quick thoughts to that. Yeah, the do's and don'ts. I think I already mentioned before. I think a total do would be to really think about housing, and that's a utopian thought, but still I want to reinforce it to think about what housing should or could be, and to change the mindset on why we treat housing as a commodity. And that's a do. And I think a don't would be, to trust the market to regulate itself, and to trust in private actors to just to make housing, just more inclusive itself. But so that won't just happen. So a do would be to really shape the market and find policies. And I think if we look at the policy briefs that the Inclusive Housing Project formulated, I think we can find quite some starting points on what to do, and I would, I think we would be happy if someone wants to take a look at what we worked on, and I'll keep it at that. So much to say about that topic.
Yeah, just adding on that, I think another do for me is to involve the people themselves, and so to involve refugees, but also NGOs and people who really have insights on the social perspectives. Yeah, and don't maybe not just theoretical concepts, but really practical ones, and maybe also don't. We talked about the special solutions, but maybe not think too much about the special solutions, because what we also said, maybe the most inclusive housing is the invisible one. So if just as many people as possible have access to the regular housing market, the different segments, so that would be the most inclusive one. Yeah.
Very quickly, I think it's nice to know that people share because they like to, because it feels good, and that this is something which urban development can also use as a potential. And don't underestimate the power of public space and personal context. We're living in a digital age, but still public space, personal context play an important role.
Thank you for those do's and don'ts, and thank you all for your time and participation today. I hope that you don't stop this conversation here. Please take it further. We will, as I mentioned earlier, publish this recording on our YouTube channel and share it in our social networks. So have a look at this if you're interested to catch up on it again. Also, for our latest news, you can sign up to our newsletter or follow us on LinkedIn. But thank you all for being here today and listening in, and for many interesting questions also in the chat that we didn't have the time to answer. But thank you, everyone, and have a nice rest of the day.